In this final installment of Becoming a Person Who Must, I want to talk about moving from the fears. Peter had said, "Get behind me, Satan," and Jesus had called Peter out on that and said, "You're not thinking the things of God, but you're focusing on the things of humanity. You're thinking about the things of humanity. You're intending those things." So if we want to become persons who must, we need to learn how to make a shift. And this brings us to the heart of this particular text, and specifically to verse 16:24 and the verses that follow it. In these verses, Jesus says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself or herself, take up his or her cross, and continuously follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a person, a man or a woman, to gain the whole world but forfeit his or her life? Or what would a person give in return for his life? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of the Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he's done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Wow, what a powerful passage. So the question for this is how do you overcome fear? Especially as it relates to mission. And I think the answer is straightforward, but it's not necessarily simple to embrace because it involves risk. And here's the thing. If we want to live the lives that God has called us to live, we're never going to be able to avoid risk. And that's where the fear comes from, because we have anxiety about what might happen to us if we go all in. But that's the word. How do I be all in for the gospel? And that's what this text is really talking about. Matthew 16:24 is a text that brings to focus all of the rest of the gospel on what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus. And let me just suggest three things quickly. The first thing may be obvious, but it's critical to say this. It's if we want to be all in, if we want to become people who must, like Jesus was. Again, where's that must come from? 16:21. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, be killed, and on the third day be raised. He must. We want to become people who must. And so if we want to become persons who must, we need to embrace a radical commitment to Jesus, because that's what changes everything. And what's it mean to deny self, take up cross, follow Jesus? To deny self, that's not just embracing some kind of ascetic life. It's not giving up chocolate at Lent. It's not watching less TV. It's actually counting yourself as though, in some ways, you were already dead. It's recognizing that there's something bigger than just my own personal survival. And that's profound. And that's what carrying the cross means. When you took your cross up in the ancient world, that doesn't mean you put on, you got a tattoo of a cross, you put a piece of jewelry on. If you took up the cross, that literally was the last thing you were going to do with your life, because you're carrying your implement of execution and you're a dead man walking. And so it's, in a sense, you're living your life by taking up the cross as though it's already over, because that completely frees you. It's that old song, I think Janis Joplin sang it. Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. When you're all in for the gospel, you recognize there's nothing left to lose. But here's the difference, because you have everything. And Jesus calls us to follow him continually into the world. And that's where, this is all based on a radical commitment to Jesus. And I think I learned this lesson, the idea here about turning away from fear and focusing on Jesus, on living, kind of as a dead man walking. When I learned to surf, it was funny. Back, I took up surfing when I was 39. I wanted to be able to do it before I was 40. And many of my friends, including folks at the seminary, suddenly became concerned that, geez, aren't you worried about getting eaten by sharks? Don't you know how many sharks are out there all around you? And I thought about that. And, my old joke was always I surf without my glasses. And so I couldn't worry about sharks because I wouldn't be able to see them anyway. But, all kidding aside, here's the deal. Why do surfers think about sharks ever? Of course. But do they spend all their time surfing worried about getting eaten by a shark? And the answer there is absolutely not. Surfers don't worry about sharks because surfers focus on surfing. And here's the thing, if you've ever caught a wave, you suddenly you feel like you're weightless. You just feel the power of the ocean lifting you up. You hear the wind. It's both simultaneously really quiet, but then you hear the wind going through your ears. And you just feel pure joy as though you're floating through the air, riding this powerful wave. And you know what? When you surf, you have a life-transforming moment. So the second that your ride ends, whether the wave dissipates or you wipe out, the only thing that you're focused on at that moment is this: I want to get another wave. And I want to suggest to each one of us as we reflect on this powerful text, the way to push through fear and to not focus on the things of humanity, but on the things of God, is to recognize that a radical commitment to Jesus is a life-transforming experience, and that overloads all the possibility of being caught up in fear, because the gospel is that thing that you've actually always been looking for, and it's flat out worth it. Back to surfing, that's why you have strange things that surfers do, like when there's a hurricane coming, everybody else is fleeing, the surfers head to the ocean because they know that in the most difficult circumstances, you're going to get the best waves. So a radical commitment to Jesus. The second thing that this passage really points at, again, we could go into more detail on all of this, is once you have that radical commitment to Jesus and you recognize that the experience of God's grace through encountering Jesus is kind of that ultimate value, like Paul says in Philippians, I want to know Christ, the power of his resurrection, is that we can now have a deep trust in this paradoxical view of life. Right after 1624, you have this whole business of the person who wants to save his life loses it. The person that loses her life will find it. Gain the whole world, lose your soul. That's paradoxical things. And so we want to recognize the really countercultural vision of a life of commitment to Jesus means. And we want to trust that paradoxical view. Let me just point out a couple things from Matthew. Go back to the Sermon on the Mount and think through it. Jesus talks about praying for those who persecute you. Jesus equates anger with murder. Jesus talks about taking logs out of our own eyes so that we can take a speck out of somebody else's eye. How the poor in spirit, the kingdom belongs to them. How the flowers of the field are dressed more beautifully than the richest person. Think about the things that we kind of take for granted in the Sermon on the Mount, or going the extra mile. These are countercultural values that we're called to live out. It's a paradox, right? And then another thing is, think about the Matthew chapter 18, this great passage on community. We're at the core of that What's the ultimate community killer? It's thinking that you're more important than everybody else and that your views are more important than everybody else's. And Matthew 18 over and over again talks about having a spirit of forgiveness and reconciliation. How does that sound in today's world, right? And so we want to have a deep trust in the paradoxical view of life that the gospel has. That a life that is focused on others and not simply ourselves, a focus on mission and not fear, is the way that actually leads to life. So if we want to be all in, if we want to learn how to become a person who can move past fear, we want to have a radical commitment to Jesus. We want to have a deep trust in this paradoxical view of life that the kingdom in the gospel presents, and embrace it. And then we want to recognize the last thing is that there's a secure future. And this comes out in a couple of ways. In Jesus' own statement about the must, he said he had to go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, and be killed, but then on the third day be raised. And then at the end of Matthew 16, 21 to 28, in verses 27 and 28, we have this eschatological vision of the Son of Man coming, in that Jesus gives the promise that some here will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. These are pictures of a secure future. Now, again, if you're taking up your cross, that doesn't necessarily guarantee your immediate future is secure, because there's always going to be risk. But the power of the gospel is to get a big picture and recognize that we're called simply to follow Jesus, moment by moment, day by day, sometimes in seasons of plenty, sometimes in seasons of want, and of even seasons of suffering and persecution. But we can do that with a real boldness because we can see the big vision, that our future is absolutely secure. So we can live holy, bold, courageous lives for the gospel now, because Jesus has already given us the promise that someday we'll see Jesus in his kingdom. So you think about this passage, think about what God is calling you. Think about God's dreams for your life. And God wants to shift us from being persons that may or might, should or could. Get rid of all the shoulds. I should do this, I should do that. No, you shouldn't. This text points us to the burning reality of what it looks like when we move again from people who may or might or should or could to people that must. Have you had that life-transforming moment when you recognize, I'm all in? If you have any questions, I'd love to have a conversation with you. I'm Brian Russell. It's my privilege to share this with you.